Um, Journalists always don't get to cover the most high-minded stories that they would like to be covering. Stories are still stories, even if they're about people like George Santos and dear God, kicking the guy out of Congress has probably made him even a hotter commodity to cover. And he's going to do everything he can to make sure that he never loses the spotlight. So he was back still in the media in the last couple of days.
I know what you're doing here, Lisa, and you have baited me and I've taken the hook. I do want to say this for your audience, for the Resolute Square audience that has only really followed my story in Ukraine. What brought me to Ukraine is that I am a political analyst, strategist, writer, and I had written a book on the refugee crisis, but I realized people weren't interested really, even in 2015, in high-minded stories. They wanted salaciousness, they wanted the tabloid. And I knew how to write a good headline, and I also knew how to back up my stories. And so I created a website, political.tips, that really was this niche market in Nevada. I was able to do it in a small state, big city, Las Vegas, where there was a lot of tabloid ready stories that if you read, you grab them with the headline, and then you make sure as a writer, as a journalist, you can back it up. And I called you earlier before the show, and I said, hey, are we going to cover George Santos talking about sloppy bottoms? Because it was exactly the type of headline I would have written on political.tips. But again, now that I'm a columnist, we don't know what the most pressing need to discuss will be from week to week. In this particular case, though, when George Santos talked about the sex scandal, and I will call it, it's scandalous to have sex in the Judiciary Committee room of the U.S. Senate. The sex scandal broke. George Santos popped up. He's proudly, and I'll say this, he's proudly homosexual male. George Santos threw out a term which is considered derogatory among those in the LGBTQ community. Ultimately, the term was sloppy bottom. And Santos utilized it as slang to rip on a Democratic former staffer who went ahead and made a fool of himself and made a mockery of the U.S. Senate. Who then gets brought into this conversation but Madison Cawthorne, a former Republican congressman from North Carolina who lost in his primary due to the fact that he claimed there were sex orgies going on in Congress. Santos then responded by talking about, quote, cages and referring to the idea that a certain journalist engaged in sex acts in cages inside the U.S. Congress. And while, again, the tabloid headline would bring in the viewers, there's something much more at play here. The fact that George Santos and Madison Cawthorne could be elected to the U.S. Congress, to have this platform, to then discuss a sex scandal that took place in the U.S. Congress, shows just how far democracy and the idea of leadership has fallen. Now, as I admitted to, I was playing a character in the role of myself on Russia Hates the Truth. And I was doing it as information warfare against the Russians. Now, if George Santos wants to come on this show, or George Santos wants to engage with us and let us know that he was playing a character this whole time, I'm certain the world would understand him better. But if him or Madison Cawthorne were truly serious about their activities, it shows yet again that an ill-informed electorate, or an electorate that is willing to follow just the top layer of news, of propaganda, how dangerous society has become, because we look to our leadership. Whether we like the U.S. Congress or not, we elect them to be our leaders, our representatives. We look to our leadership to right the ship in order to lead us to a brighter, better, bolder future. And luckily for the United States, neither Madison Cawthorne nor George Santos hold places in Congress any longer. But again, utilizing those two and others on both sides as icons of what has gone wrong over the past 20 years in government, we can laugh at George Santos, but we better not laugh with George Santos. We can scoff at Madison Cawthorne, but we better not scoff with Madison Cawthorne.
Yeah, they're both such they are characters. They are such despicable human beings, and the amount that it took, just how many lines they had to cross, is so indicative of what both Congress and the American electorate has become willing to accept in the conduct of these aren't small local elections. These are federal elections. These are these used to be, and there have always been scandals in Congress. There have always been sex scandals in Congress. There are a lot that we never found out about that would have been scandals, but that this sort of thing can be talked about now, and that George Santos can compare this latest sex scandal and say that it is the most offensive thing to have happened inside the Capitol, when we have in very recent memory a goddamn insurrection that happened in the Capitol. And that is not a huge story, that we can now equate these things, and it's a blip.
I'd like to add one thing to what George Santos just said and what you said. Since January 7th, 2021, the most offensive thing to happen in the Capitol was the seating of George Santos as a congressman from New York. Ultimately, for him to even suggest it in historical terms is laughable, because ultimately George Santos doesn't even know his own history, let alone to talk about the history of the United States. And he's a clown, yes, but he's a dangerous clown, because what he does is reinforce the psychosis that has overtaken so many on social media. And this is happening on the left and right. There was a story in Politico last week about a woman who was running for the state House of Delegates in Virginia. She was involved in a sex scandal. She was doing something on camera with her husband, consenting adults, I believe for money. And Politico ran the story as if she was a victim of revenge porn. Ultimately, we have to take responsibility for our own actions. As somebody who's been in the public spotlight now for close to 2 years on a global scale, I understand that you have to take responsibility for what you carry out. And when I see those such as George Santos trying to scoff at the fact that he's been expelled from Congress, or Madison Cawthorne trying to claim victory now after the voters of North Carolina threw him out, or a consenting adult who's now going on some sort of victimization tour from the Democratic Party after she lost a very winnable seat for the Dems in Virginia, it goes again to show how far we have fallen in media, how far we've fallen in society, and again, how far we must claw our way back to make certain that we don't live on the precipice of autocracy for the next generation or two. Because when you're on the ledge for that long, all it takes is a small slip and you've lost everything.